countrymen and women, Americans, or as Judd Ashman, the good mayor of Gaithersburg, likes to say, people of the book, happy Memorial Day weekend and welcome to the 2020 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, or as we like to call it, the VGBF. I'm Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host.
Countrymen and women, Americans, or as Judd Ashman, the good mayor of Gaithersburg, likes to say, people of the book, happy Memorial Day weekend and welcome to the 2020 Virtual
Well, we miss
Gaithersburg
hosting you in person.
or as we
We're
like to
happy
call
to
it.
have you at this evening's presentation.
I'm Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host. Countrymen and
Before
women,
we head out to tonight's event,
or as Judd Ashman, the good mayor of Gaithersburg, likes to say, people of the book, Gaithersburg,
like this video.
and welcome to
Second,
the 2020 Virtual Gaithersburg in person, or as we like to call it, have you at
the
this
subscribe bell to get notifications
Kaminsky,
of
your
our latest
VGBF
and new presentations.
head out to tonight's
You will undoubtedly have questions during this presentation. By all means, please post them in the chat. Most of them, if not all, will be relayed to the authors and will be answered at the end of this presentation. Also, we encourage you to support tonight's author by purchasing his book through independent bookseller and our partner, Politics and Prose. And many, many, many big thank yous go out to our sponsors, the David and Mikel Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown, RPAI, and Montgomery College. Okay, let's get started. Tonight we have Louis Bayard here to talk
Our
with us
partner.
about his book, Courting Mr. Lincoln, which is a beautifully written historical novel about the brilliant, melancholic future president and the two people who knew him best, his confidant, Joshua Speed, and the spirited young debutante, Mary Todd. Louis is a New York Times notable book author and has been shortlisted for both the Edgar and Dagger Awards for his historical thrillers, which include The Pale Blue Eye and Mr. Timothy. His most recent novel was the critically acclaimed young adult title, Lucky Strikes. He lives in Washington, D.C. and teaches at George Washington University. Interviewing Lou tonight is Jennifer Bort Yacovissi. Jennifer is the author of Up the Hill to Come and a member of PEN America, and also the National Book Critics Circle. She writes a monthly column and reviews regularly for the Washington Independent Review of Books, where she serves on the board of directors. She has served as chair and program director of the Washington Writers Conference since 2017. Lou and Jenny, welcome to the program.
Book Critics Circle.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Monthly column and reviews
so much,
regularly
Phil.
for the Washington Independent Review of Books,
Jenny,
where she serves on
Jenny, this is tech support. Sorry, but we are getting some feedback, possibly off of the YouTube feed, off of your computer.
Not enough of mine here. Thank you.
monthly column and reviews regularly for the Washington Independent.
Feedback, possibly off of the YouTube feed, off of your computer.
I didn't realize.
Not enough of mine here. Thank you.
Column and reviews regularly for the Washington Independent.
Didn't realize.
Not enough of mine here. Thank you.
And I don't think we're hearing it anymore, Jenny.
Alrighty.
This would never be happening if we were in Gaithersburg right now.
It's absolutely true.
We would just be hearing choo-choo trains come through. I missed that.
Anyway, I apologize about that. I thought sure that I was completely disconnected from everything. Anyway, so we've done it now. We've had our
We've
first
done it.
ugly glitch. Let's hope that we get through the rest of it without any problems.
Yes, there won't be anything because there's no pressure that this is the first Friday night thing that they're doing, right? At the Gaithersburg.
Exactly. So, well,
Yes, not to fuck this up. Yeah.
exactly. Lou told me not to F it up, and here we go. Anyway, thanks so much, Phil and Caroline and everyone who has put together a wonderful program for virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. Lou and I would have been doing this last Saturday with Bert Solomon, but here we are on a rainy Friday night, so we can chat about a great book. Anyway, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that Lou, how you came to historical fiction, because the first two novels you wrote were contemporary sort of comic novels.
Yeah.
And then you slid right into historical mystery with Mr. Timothy. So I was kind of wondering how that happened.
Slid is a good verb, past tense verb to use for this. I always think the word accidental should apply to anything that's said about me or what I do. I'm an accidental historical novelist, accidental mystery writer, accidental thriller writer, but it started with Tiny Tim and my desire to write a book about him. And I wanted to write a book about him because I love Charles Dickens more than any other author, and because I hated Tiny Tim more than any other Dickens character. So out of that was born a desire to visit harm on Tiny Tim. And yeah, I just felt somebody needed to do that. But I realized that if I were going to do that, that I needed to learn a little bit about the past, about Victorian London. And I was initially terrified by that because I thought, oh God, there's no end to what I'll need to know. What did they wear? What were the carriages like? What did they eat? What did it smell like? And I was really, frankly, terrified about the work that would require. So I dipped my toe in, I dipped another toe in. And by the time I dipped my whole 2 legs and torso in, I realized, oh, this is kind of fun. This is kind of fun to recover these lost worlds, because they are lost. Victorian London is mostly gone. And it was enormous fun to kind of try to recover these places and figure out what would be going on and what would people, when they opened the door, what would they see when they walked down the street? So actually the discipline now is for me to say, okay, you've done enough research now, and actually start writing this book, because I could spend many years doing that, as historians do. And I never feel like I learn enough really about any era that I study or any historical personage. I just learn enough to start to write my story.
And do you tend to read, for example, contemporary fiction? Like, so you started with Tiny Tim, a literary character, and so you could start by reading, obviously, your favorite author, Charles Dickens.
Yes, it was an excuse to read Charles Dickens, more Charles Dickens, yeah. But also Wilkie Collins, you know, who is Dickens's friend and a wonderful writer of suspense and mystery fiction from that same time. So, yeah, I just gave myself an excuse to just jump into that world and see what I found there. And and I haven't looked back. I thought of it as an accident, but my oldest brother, you know, some years back said, you know, this is so native to you. I don't know why you think it was an accident. It was so. Maybe it was providence, because I do love the challenge of rediscovering these lost eras.
Do you, one of the things I found is that I like to do sort of just-in-time research, because you could, as you said, you know, you can go forever if you just keep searching. And what I found was that what I needed to know was enough to sort of get me into the feeling of where I wanted to be. And then as I was writing, have the writing tell me where I needed to dig more.
That's exactly what I felt too. Is the book instructs me as to what I still need to know, which is often considerable. And there are things that I just, from page to page, I'm like, okay, what would an outhouse have looked like, right? What would the sewers have looked like? The danger, the concomitant danger is to go, as I said, to go too deep and feel like, okay, I've learned all this stuff about Parisian sewers circa 1818, and now I'm going to share them all with you.
Right.
All the stuff I've learned, I'm going to share with you. And I consider that the gold star syndrome of historical novelists. So it's like, here, see how diligent I've been. I've been in the Library of Congress, the Rose Reading Room in New York, wherever you've been. Just see, I've been very diligent. See, I want my star, my gold star. And what I find is when I go through successive rewrites of a book, that it's the research that tends to fall away more than anything else, because I've done too much of it. And I will say that when I read historical novels that just bury me in that stuff, I get very impatient. It's like, I want a story. I just give me your story. Let me do the rest.
One of the things that I say is that the story doesn't need to have it, but you need to have it. You need to understand how, like I would say, you would never describe how a telephone works in a contemporary novel, but,
yeah.
And you shouldn't be describing how a telephone works in,
right.
right?
They picked up the telephone, they placed a call, exactly.
But you, as the author, need to know how that telephone would have worked so that you are using correct language about it. You're not,
right.
It's not an anachronism. So
I would assume, but you know, Edward Jones, he wrote The Known World, which is one of my favorite historical novels ever written, about slave-owning African Americans in the 19th century. And it's a brilliant book. And he claimed not to have done an ounce of research for it. I don't know whether I believe him, but he said, it's like, well, they jump on a horse. It's like, do I need to know what kind of horse it was? Do I need to describe the saddle? No. In the same way, we don't need to describe in contemporary fiction, he got into a car. He didn't insert the key into the ignition or press, you know, we don't need to do that. So it's an interesting balance and an interesting tension between what we actually need to know and what we actually tell people.
Correct. So as you were approaching courting Mr. Lincoln, did you have any sort of trepidation, or did perhaps your publisher or editor have any trepidation about, oh no, yet another Lincoln novel?
Well, that's a good point, because I checked the Library of Congress catalog and there were 9,100 books about Abraham Lincoln. I think that number is low. I think there have been many more books about Abraham Lincoln. So all I can say is that I felt like I found a particular niche, a particular window into him, into his life that hadn't been there, at least in fictional terms. And that was what inspired me to go forward. I should say I didn't have an editor at this point. I didn't have a publisher. It was just me and my agent kind of working something out. I was between publishers, as they say in the business. And so I was just trying to find a story that interested me. I should probably give credit to, except I'm going to botch her name. She wrote The Paris Wife. What was her name?
Sorry.
Paula. Somebody's going to text. Somebody is even now is yes. Gosh, I interviewed her at the Tucson Book Festival, and that book, it was basically about Ernest Hemingway's first wife and his first wife,
right,
in Paris, and then the woman who came along and stole Ernest away from Hadley. And there was another book that came out around the same time called Loving Frank, about Frank Lloyd Wright and his mistress. And so they came out around the same time. They both did very well. And I thought, what an interesting template to look at a famous person through the eyes of somebody who loved him or her. And what an interesting angle that is to take on somebody. So literally on the plane back from Tucson, I'm thinking, well, who else would that kind of work for? And I think Lincoln really was the first one, the first name that came across. And I think it was simply because Mary Todd, what was up with that? What was going on with that marriage, you know? And I suddenly realized I had no idea how they got together, what brought them together, what kept them together through this rather long and complex and enduring marriage. So that was, I think, kind of where it started.
And so so in looking into that, that's when you sort of stumbled on the story of Joshua Speed.
I stumbled onto it again because I think I'd heard it some years earlier. There was a book that came out, gosh, I'm gonna blank on this name too. This is why Friday nights are hard for me, but The Private Life of Abraham Lincoln, C.A. Tripp wrote it. That's not the real name, but it sounds like that. It sounds like a soap opera about Abraham Lincoln. And it came out in the aughts, let's say 2006, 2008. And it was, I thought, really eye-opening because it looked at all his relationships with men in his life. They include Joshua Speed, the guy he shared a bed with for 3.5 years, but also Billy Green and all these people, and right up to including the White House years where he supposedly shared a bed with his bodyguards. So there was a long record of Lincoln being in close physical proximity with men, with close male friends. That's the customary disclaimer rushes in. The bachelors often shared beds in those days. Bedding was expensive, so we take that all into account. But this was the first book that I'm aware of, C.A. Tripp, to really kind of bring it all into one book and suggest that there was a pattern behind that. And suddenly, what I considered to be a relatively straightforward courtship novel, a Jane Austen kind of novel, between Lincoln and Mary Todd became a love triangle with Joshua Speed, kind of patrolling the perimeter. And with Lincoln really in the center, but also the most enigmatic figure of all.
Interesting. So, I will tell you that I was so relieved to have Mary Todd be a sympathetic figure in this book, because she is truly, it's hard to find a more widely and sort of universally reviled figure in popular history. And I can't think of an instance, at least in film, where she has ever been portrayed sympathetically. And so I was thrilled to see her be a real developed character here.
And that really came out of the research. That came out of going back into the historical novelist time machine to Springfield, Illinois, circa 1841, 1842, and looking at what was actually there. And I admit to my own shame that I didn't recognize this Mary Todd for the very reasons you've discussed. I think that the Mary Todd that's been passed down to us through the years is the mad woman. She's the spendthrift. She's the millstone around Lincoln's neck. She's just a constant source of misery. And that's because, and we can certainly talk about this, it's because her history was written by her enemies. And that story, that narrative carried forward for at least another century and still carrying forward today. But I was delighted really to meet this other Mary Todd, this young version. This is the best version of Mary Todd to capture, is the young Mary Todd, where she's attractive, very attractive, and it's brilliant. Even her enemies call her brilliant, and witty, and eminently marriageable. And the more I researched, the more I realized the real question wasn't why Lincoln picked Mary Todd, but why Mary Todd picked Lincoln. Because that was an act of prescience that I think historians don't quite credit. This was 1841, 1842. Springfield, Lincoln was on no one's short list to become president of anything, let alone America, within 20 years. And somehow or other, she divined some potential in him that frankly, I don't think anybody else did, with maybe the exception of Mrs. Francis. So to me, that speaks volumes to her political instincts. And of course, she was very passionate politically. Her whole goal was to marry a politician and to carry him to the highest mark. And one of the most revealing comments to me about the Lincoln marriage was when Lincoln first learned he was elected, and his first words were, "Mary, Mary, we are elected," which shows to me that this was always a partnership. I will only say the only other two first ladies that I think have been as vilified are Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton, and maybe Nancy Reagan. So it's interesting. I wrote an article about for the Post about this, that I don't think America always knows what to do with strong women, with women who have ambition of their own. And in those days, the only way a politically passionate woman could express that passion was to marry a Sidwell politician. So that's what she did. Today, she'd be Speaker of the House.
Exactly. And again, I was very surprised because, again, since I've taken the popular view of Mary Todd also, I was very surprised to find out that she was so politically engaged, and that she, as she says, the man who wants to court me needs to bring me polling results. And that's
polling results. That is in the book, and that's an actual historical episode where Lincoln sent her the results of his elections, because he was in the Illinois State House, and at least one year he got more votes than any other person in his party. So he rolled up. This actually happened. He rolled up the sort of results, the poll results, into a basket and arranged them like flowers, so that she could understand that he was a serious candidate, that he had a real future, and she responded accordingly. They both found in each other what they needed to find.
Well, and again, it's interesting because at least the way you're presenting the characters in the book, I don't find myself questioning why they're attracted to each other, because it's obvious that Lincoln is intriguing to a lot of people, and that there is a magnetism to him that draws other people. And as you said, Mrs. Francis, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit, she obviously understood the potential that he showed. And again, to your point about women sort of understanding the way that they had any power at all is to choose a candidate and figure out how to back that candidate and bring bring the force of perhaps their social circle to back that person.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what makes this, in my mind, it's kind of it's a Jane Austen novel. My editor said it's a Jane Austen novel with Lincoln in the middle.
Yep.
Because it's about, Jane Austen. We think it's like the original rom-com, right? Ever. I don't think people always appreciate how serious the courtship ritual was for women of that era. This was their one shot, right? They had to pick the right man because this was their one chance to make, to get family, to get status, to get any kind of, to get income, to get, this was so critically important. And then you throw in the political angle on it, and Mary Todd is, looking around, and she turned down Stephen Douglas, supposedly. Stephen Douglas, who was a far more promising politician than Lincoln, was of course his later political rival, but she turned him down. So she had standards, and she knew what she was looking for. So again, I'm just amazed at her prescience and her discernment.
Right. So again, as we get into the way that you presented the story, which I just thought was truly the thing that was most compelling to me about the story, was how you presented it with sections, first with Mary, then with Joshua, and alternating through. And especially as it shows the same scene from each of their perspectives. And so I'm wondering if did it take you a while to hit upon that as the way that you were presenting that story, or did you know that sort of ahead of time?
I think I had to figure that out before I could go forward. And what I love about multiple narrators, whether it's 2 or 3 or however many, is that they cast doubt on each other. We talked about the unreliable narrator, but the more narrators you have, the more unreliable each narrator becomes. And so, as you said, they're sometimes in the same room, observing the same things, and they come away with a completely different interpretation of what's happening. And I love that, because it means you can't really rely on anybody in this. You have to kind of find your own truth. I will say that I was very clear from the front that Lincoln would not be one of the narrators. And I think that was a reference, sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that he himself was such an enigma to the people, even to the people who knew him best, his law partners, his wife, his people, even people who should have known, felt like they knew him, never felt like they did. And I think in some ways that's why there are 9,100 books about him, 9,101 now, books about him, because we're still getting a handle on him. There is still that core of mystery about him and who he was, and how did this guy with 1 year of formal schooling, right, rise out of the wilderness and become this incredible leader, a leader that we dearly wish we could have today. And I should also add, one of the great writers of the 19th century. His prose is just so exquisite. And how did that happen? And there are lots of things to consider and lots of theories about it. But surely Mary was a big part of making that happen. One of Mary's cousin, who was also Lincoln's first law partner, said Lincoln by himself would never become president because he was too melancholic, because he was too depressive. It was his wife who made him president. So I think her role in all this has been undervalued, as she herself has been undervalued.
Right. So it is interesting that, yes, Lincoln always remains the mystery in so if you're writing historical mystery, he's sort of mystery. Yeah. And again, he holds his feelings close to the vest. It's interesting how he knows to keep his approach to Mary secret from Joshua. And certainly we see Joshua responding basically like a jealous lover, right? And one of the things you had commented on before was that Mary and Joshua are in competition for Lincoln's affections, but Mary doesn't know that she's in competition with Joshua for Lincoln's affections. Right. And so it's this very interesting, it's just the dynamic is just amazing to watch.
Oh, I'm thank you for saying amazing. Yeah, because I was, yeah. I mean, it's it's interesting. You're right. Mary is in some ways the one who's least aware of what's happening, going on. But in his own way, I don't think Joshua is aware of what's happening. I think the feelings that he's feeling, whatever the jealousy, the possessiveness, I don't think he would have been able to name the word. For instance, the word homosexual was decades away from being in the English language. There was no word to describe feelings of intimacy or tenderness toward your own sex. The one word that was available was sodomy, which was simply about a sexual act. So one of the reasons that it's portrayed in the indirect and I think subtle way that it's portrayed in this book is that that's how it would have been felt. There would have been no sense of, oh, well, clearly I'm this or I'm that. No categories they would have put themselves in. And I don't think Joshua, if he did have these feelings, and that is the whole conjecture of this book, would have been able to say, oh, because I have these feelings, I must be this, or this must be this. So I think it would have been a mess really for them because he wouldn't have had the vocabulary to discuss it.
Well, I mean, so he certainly asks Lincoln early on, sort of, how far do you see yourself going? Mm-hmm. And I feel as though that's his way of sort of thinking through what can I be to you, sort of.
Yes. Yes.
Because I did wonder whether, from your perspective, your Joshua, because we never hear him interrogate his own feelings or thoughts about Lincoln in any direct way, but some of his actions are kind of over the top, like having Lincoln followed.
Right. By a private detective. Yeah.
He's kind of, again, very much like a wife trying to catch her husband in an affair, right? And again, he plots this way of getting back at Lincoln because he's gonna pull up stakes and go home, and that'll show him.
Yeah.
You're gonna pick up with her. Well, then fine, right?
Yeah, fine. See if you enjoy this. Yeah.
And so. So I was wondering whether he never thinks about what it is that he really wants. What does he see this being? Either because, like you say, he can't go there, or that he's so sure of himself that I can imagine that he sees himself. Just as they talk about the Lincoln Speed special, two old guys toddling down the road together, sharing their lives together, and that was good for him, right?
Well, and of course, it was a very common arrangement in those days. You had the bachelors, the confirmed bachelors, the people, those guys who hung out together for the rest of their lives, and to me, Joshua doesn't know himself, I think he's in denial, or even not to the point of denial, just doesn't have the capacity to understand what he's feeling. So it erupts in these strange ways. I should add, though, that I think there's two different closets in this book. One is with Lincoln and Speed, but the other one is Lincoln and Mary, because they're closeted in Mrs. Francis's drawing room, and they're hiding out from the world, right? Because she knows that her sister won't approve of this marriage, and so they're having these covert assignations, in this drawing room. So to me, it's just about the love that dare not
speak either way,
right? In any way, yes. So.
And is that historically accurate that they were in fact meeting in?
Yes, that is historically accurate. Yes, and it's also true that Mary's sister and brother-in-law thought Lincoln was a disastrous match for her. They're very much opposed to it, and it's interesting. One of the things that they were opposed to him is they found him very cold. They thought he was very reticent and cold, and Mary herself was very vulnerable and needy and emotional and. So, and in some ways they were right. The marriage was a bit of a mismatch because Lincoln was gone for months out of the year, traveling the circuit, the court circuit of Illinois. So she was really essentially a single parent for their children, was 4 total. And yes, and I'm sure she felt starved. At one point, Joshua refers to her as a thirsty lily, And I think that would have been the case for her. She had emotional needs, and I'm not sure that Lincoln was capable of meeting them. But you know, they found a way of getting along. And certainly, at least publicly, her devotion to Lincoln never faltered while he was alive or after he was dead. So.
Well, there's a note somewhere that I was reading that the night that he was assassinated, she was sitting next to him in the booth, holding his hand and saying something about how, oh, what will the folks that were next to them think of her, you know, holding on to him? And he said, I don't think anything, right? So even to that point, they were pretty close. So one of the things I see here, I thought that you had made up Billy Green as a character. Wrong in that. So Billy Green was interesting to me because his appearance drew Joshua up short. Especially at the concept of that Billy also got a gold engraved watch from Lincoln. But it was interesting to me that the introduction of Billy spoke kind of to Lincoln's character a little bit, that here was yet another person who, like you said, Lincoln only had a year's worth of schooling, but here was somebody who had spent a lot of time helping to school Lincoln through, right? To teach him grammar and things like that. And then here's Joshua trying to smooth him out and teach him how to dress.
His manners,
himself in society. And so here's two long-term friends who are working very hard to smooth the edges out of Lincoln, and that it's like with Billy, it's obvious that he said thank you with that watch, and then he moved on. So it's kind of interesting to me that Lincoln was willing to take that help, and then.
He certainly was. I guess we should explain for people who haven't read the book yet. Billy Green was Lincoln's roommate and bedmate back in New Salem before he even got to Springfield, Illinois. He was hanging out in New Salem. And he and Billy Green lived together, shared a bed together. I think a neighbor said, Abe and Billy had an awful hankering one for t'other. So again, one of those remarks that in the 21st century raises an eyebrow. But it was a very similar relationship where they shared a bed, they shared a life, and Billy definitely helped him up the ladder. And one of the things I learned about Lincoln in the course of this research is that, you know, he was not above using people. He was deeply ambitious from a very young age, and he wanted to ascend, and he was willing to use what people had to offer. And so, yeah, Billy was helpful, and then Billy's usefulness was done, and then Abe went to Springfield to to mount his career in the state legislature. But he had that in him. I don't think people realize how ambitious he was. You know, people think of him as this sort of, you know, this saint really who kind of wanders in out of the woods and manages to become president. Nobody manages to become president or even state legislator from New Salem. You have to work. And in fact, he was he was considered a bit of an attack dog for the Whig Party. At that time, they would use him in debates against Democrats to kind of, you know, I'm trying to think of a modern example, but somebody who would really, some Fox News personality, but going after them. And in fact, the book includes two of the things that he was most embarrassed about in later life. One is the climax. I won't divulge it for people who haven't read the book, but one was just an incident where in the State House, the Whigs of whom Lincoln was a member wanted to deny a quorum to the Democrats. So Lincoln and two other Whigs literally jumped out of a window to prevent that from happening. Even though it had already happened, it was a complete mess. It was humiliating. The Democratic newspapers had made great hay with it. And Lincoln for the rest of his life was deeply embarrassed about it. So he's still a young politician and he's still making mistakes and he's still overreaching and he's flawed, he's fallible.
One of my favorite scenes in the book is when Mrs. Francis, whom we spoke about a little bit, who truly seems to understand the potential that Lincoln really has. And she is definitely working to groom him for greater things. And she gently takes Joshua aside and explains to him, you're going to have to let him go. And she seems to sort of understand at a larger level sort of
what's going on. Yeah,
going
yeah.
on. It's really an interesting exchange to think about that. And so
Yeah,
I love how you wrote Mrs. Francis.
Well, I should say Mrs. Francis is almost entirely a fictional creation because I don't know, there's not a lot about her. She was the wife of the newspaper editor for the Sangamon County newspaper. And in those days, the editors of newspapers were the head of their political party. They were basically the bosses of their party. So her husband was the #1 Whig in that region. So she used her. It seems clear to me that she used her again, that being the wife of, used that power, whatever it attached to her, to groom people. And one of the stories that has survived about her is that, yes, that she brought Mary and Lincoln into her parlor to meet and court. But then when they briefly separated, that she was the one who brought them back together and said, just be friends, just be friends. And then that marriage finally moved out of that. So I figured here's this, again, like Mary, a fiercely ambitious woman married to a politician, and she wants to use her power. She wants to groom. But the scene with Joshua you're talking about is where this is completely a fictionalized scene. This is my imagination, but she brings him in and says, you've done such great work with Lincoln. You've improved his manners. Now I think you should step aside and let me take care of the rest. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the book because it's so intense. One of my models when I was writing the book was Henry James, particularly Washington Square, because he was so great at these parlor scenes, these very serene exteriors, upper class exteriors, where everything on the surface is happening very quietly and politely, and people are pouring tea for each other. And underneath there's all this turbulence, and the tension between that outer serenity and the inner turbulence is so intoxicating. Henry James is one of my favorite writers for that reason, because you just feel people are just waiting to burst out of burst out of the page at every moment, and they can't.
Right.
And tension is sort of excruciating in the most wonderful sort of way. Edith Wharton has some of that too, I think, in the.
Right. Again, those are things that we ourselves don't have to think in terms of anymore, because what's not socially acceptable anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the mores have changed. I mean, the idea that, yes, the whole idea of what the phrase make love to in those days meant just, woo.
Exactly, wooing, exactly.
Yes.
So I will tell you that one of the things that your book made me think more about was the fact that, so we know that both Lincoln and Mary struggled with mental illness through their lives, different issues with mental health, and for some reason we use that as a mitigating factor for Lincoln, that makes him more sympathetic, that he was able to achieve so much even though he was truly depressed, and yet with Mary we refuse to cut her any slack at all, and we blame her for the challenges that she had. And I think that's fascinating even today, that we can't seem to give her any sort of slack about that.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I wrote a whole piece for the Washington Post about this, about how the misogyny and the sexism that have inflected how we think about her, how we talk about her. I will just say, in terms of nuance, that Lincoln's illness was inward. It was a very deep melancholy. And in fact, one of the central mysteries in the book is this depressive episode he had in January of 1842, where he was at his lowest ebb of his entire life, up to and including the Civil War, the deaths of his children. And historians traditionally try to figure out, okay, what caused this? Because he referred to the fateful 1st of January. Well, two things happened. One was he broke off with Mary Todd, and the other one was that Joshua Speed said, I'm going back home. So these are two traumas, twin traumas, capping two very intense relationships all happening at the same time. So there's a lot to dig into there. But Lincoln, when he got ill, he just sort of prostrated himself. He went to bed. Mary's illness manifested itself outward. Exactly. And I should say her illness has never been conclusively diagnosed. I've heard bipolar, I've heard narcissistic personality syndrome, borderline personality. I've heard lots of things, but the way it manifested itself was going outward, and she was in many ways her own worst enemy. She alienated friends and family. I think the more public a figure she became, the more her private demons, whatever they were, came to the fore. So she inevitably got quite awful press. You know, she had the worst press of any first lady, and there's a lot of competition. But I think she wins it. So, but yeah, I think it's a different kind of illness. But at the same time, there's still is a discomfort with the idea of powerful women in the American body politic. We still have trouble with it.
And I do feel as though there's that difference between his was a quiet illness and hers was very noisy.
Yeah, that's the perfect distinction. It was noisy. It was noisy. It was public. It was public. She made scenes, you know.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, as you said, you know, the spending great amounts of money and everything.
Yes, no, there's no question she contributed to her own bad press. There's no question.
And again, so we could talk about this all night, I'm sure.
Yes.
So one of the things I'm just curious about, I first experienced Courting Mr. Lincoln by listening to it on audiobooks, and it made me think that, and then I read it, knowing that I was preparing to.
That's due diligence, Jenny. There's a lot of work.
There you go.
They're paying you for this.
So I listened to it for my sheer enjoyment, because rarely do I get to just read a book for my own enjoyment. And then later, when I knew that I was going to talk to you and Bert last weekend at the GBF, so I read it again. But it's interesting to me, the difference between listening to a book and reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, I bet it's excruciating for an author to listen to somebody else read their book. And you said something about how you have trouble listening to.
I do, and that's not a reflection on the narrators at all, because the ones who did Courting Mr. Lincoln, I'm told, did a wonderful job, and that they got an award. You know, and who heard it and said they did a great job. So I'm delighted. What my issue with any audiobook narrator, and maybe this is something you may understand, is that I hear a particular music, you know, in the lines,
right?
Because I have written them, and I read the whole book at some point out loud, just to make sure it's okay. And in doing that, I get a particular cadence in my head, and inevitably that's not the cadence that a narrator can bring. So it's hard for me to listen to it, because for that reason. I will say that I don't know if my editor's in the audience or not. So I actually wanted to do the audiobook for this, but it's a completely different outfit that does this. You kind of give away the rights, and they decide, who's the narrator. And inevitably, especially for fiction, they will pick professional actors. And why wouldn't they? Because you have to do different voices and read different, and provide. Yeah, it's very hard. I know it's very hard. So they're very smart, and they go after professional actors. So I could have done it, but I would have had to audition. And the idea of auditioning for my own book and then fucking it up was just more than I could bear. So I let them at it. And actually, I love the fact that they have both a woman reading Mary and then a man reading Joshua. I think that's a great idea.
And what was really interesting was it's true. And then being the listener of it, it's a very intimate experience to listen to a book. But it was interesting to hear both Mary and Joshua represent Lincoln's voice.
So what was that like? So how different were I assume the voice was rather different.
They were, it's actually, they sounded rather similar, which was.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
So anyway, I do wonder though about, for an author, how it feels that there's a layer in between your words and your audience, so that there's somebody else who's interpreting your words for that audience. And I would think that would be hard, right?
Well, I mean, it's a good problem to have, because it means that your book is getting out into the world in a different way. So I'm not ungrateful for that at all.
Right.
It reminds me of the issue of translation, though, because I have been translated, I don't know, a dozen languages over 9 books.
Right.
So, and the only language I even know at all is French. And I read the French translation for, I think it was The Pale Blue Eye. And within 3 pages, I found an error, you know. And this translator, I should say, was like the most diligent. He sent me questions. He was so professional about it. He worked so hard on it. I was so appreciative of the work he did. And yet within 3 pages, there was an error. So it just reminds me there are all sorts of ways our work goes out into the world and we have so little control over it. So we just have to be glad that it's out there in some fashion or other.
There you go.
Right?
So this is my last question before we open it up to the other folks who are online to ask their questions. So are there other dead presidents that are coming up, or what?
There is another dead president. There's another dead president, more recently dead. The book I'm working at right now is another courtship novel, but it's about Jack and Kennedy and Jackie Bouvier. And it's set in DC, so I don't have to travel as far this time or as far back in time, because we're talking about 1953, 52, 53. So that's when it happens. And yeah, and the third party in this one is Lem Billings, who was Jack Kennedy's best friend from Choate onward, and is a kind of Zelig-like presence at the back of all these official White House photographs, because he was there every weekend. So he would just sort of traipse into the background whenever they were taking official photographs. He was a big guy with glasses and a big smile. And he was also, I should say, gay, closeted, but active.
Yeah.
And it seems that both Jack and Jackie knew that about him. And he was close to both of them. So there's an interesting kind of triangular relationship that's developing around this too, which I'm still figuring out, but it's fun.
Excellent. Well, I can't wait. I'm sure other folks can't either. So
Me too. I can't wait either, Dalston.
Excellent. So I'm going to turn it back over to Phil, who's going to, I think, read some questions to us.
Yes. Hi, Phil.
Really? Hey, I'm back. Listen, 9,000 plus books about Lincoln, but after this interview, yours is right up on top.
Right. It's #1.
That was fantastic. And it was Paula McLean, the Paris wife, right?
Paula McLean, thank you.
There you go.
I'm sure she's not watching, but anyway.
Hey, listen, I had to look it up. I didn't know on the top of my head. We've got some questions for you. Absolutely. So we've got a few here. First one, this question is from Megan Westell, or Westell. I'm sorry if I've got that wrong, Megan. Obviously, the story at the center of the book about Abe and Joshua was surprising to you, Lou, but were there any other things that you found in your research that were surprising?
I think it's the stuff that we've already talked about. To me, the surprise was Mary, above all, was Mary, and just figuring out how, what a considerable person she was. And one of the delightful responses that I've had from people is kind of what Jenny was alluding to earlier, is that I didn't realize Mary was so cool. And that was I saw it as part of my duty to kind of bring that back to the world, because she is a Jane Austen heroine, right? And she's very spirited and she's funny and she has all those qualities. And there's a reason, you know, Lincoln wanted her as a wife. You know, she had all these assets. So I see that as my job to kind of rehabilitate her reputation in the world.
Right. All right. This next one's from Tammy. All right. And this is a 2-part question. 1, have you ever wanted to write nonfiction history? And then, who do you think is the best Lincoln biographer?
Whew. Them's fighting words. Well, this is where I admit how incomplete my research is, because I don't necessarily read a lot of Lincoln biographies. I learned about him up to the age of 32. I'm not sure what happened to him after that, honestly. Did he do okay? I mean, was he elected anything?
Oh, successful.
So I will say the biographer I enjoyed, that I particularly liked as I was writing, was Carl Sandburg, who is was the biographer. He was a poet, a famous poet, but he also wrote this very popular series of biographies about Lincoln back in the 1910s, 1920s. Interestingly about him, he was the one who first kind of flagged the Lincoln Speed relationship. He said there was, quote, a touch of lavender about them, which back in those days was a really kind of interesting way of putting it. So Sandburg is great, but I will also add, thanks to Sidney Blumenthal, does a wonderful job of portraying. He did a couple of recent biographies of Lincoln. he's doing his own series, and he does a wonderful job of portraying the political Lincoln and the ambitious young man that he surely was. So that's the question. What was the first question?
Yeah, the first question we had was, have you ever wanted to write nonfiction history?
You raise a good point, because I maintain that all history is fiction. I think we're all just writing on a continuum, and I think historians are just writing their own story based on the facts that are available to them. The one thing that I think historical novelist has is the ability, as we've just been talking about, to invent whole cloth some scene, to imagine your way into how something might have been. But I don't see us as engaged in imposed pursuits. I think we're all just telling our stories one way or another.
All right. All right, Ryan S. writes, the history of Lincoln's reoccurring crossing paths with Douglas reminds me of Hamilton and Burr. What are your thoughts on this?
That makes sense. In this case, Lincoln and Douglas were rivals for the same woman, right? Mary Todd. So that adds an extra layer. I don't think that was true of Hamilton and Burr. And fortunately, they didn't kill each other. In fact, I think Douglas died before Lincoln did, shortly after, and not too long after losing the presidency to him. So yeah, it's an interesting, and Douglas makes a cameo appearance in the book. He was the opposite of Lincoln. He was small, he was squat, and he was alpha. He was very, and in the book I try to tease out the contrasts between them. Very, very different characters, but obviously both very gifted in their own way.
All right. Jenny writes, I found the book very moving, especially the discreet way you treated the relationship between Joshua and Lincoln. Did you know from the start that you would be writing it this way?
I think so. One of the scenes, the reason I created an epilogue really was to get in this scene that actually happened. And this was 20 years after Lincoln and Speed parted. And it was a few months before Lincoln was inaugurated, and they met again in Chicago with their respective wives. And they were all kind of chatting in the outer room. And then Lincoln did something remarkable. He said, oh, Speed and I are going to go into the bedroom and close the door and just chat for a little bit. Who knows what the wives were thinking in that moment, but they did. They go into the bedroom, they close the door. And then Lincoln does something extraordinary. He jumps into the bed at some point, as though he's picking up exactly where they left off 20 years earlier. And I thought that was so evocative and of that relationship that I thought, I gotta get that in there somewhere. So that became the part of the epilogue. And the other part of the epilogue is this very sad finish for Mary Todd. And it's because I liked her so much that I keep imagining alternative paths for her where she finds some kind of happiness, but history would not allow. But so I think I always had a sense of the arc of the book, and I knew it had to end with the marriage itself, because it is a courtship novel. So it had to end with the marriage between Lincoln and Mary Todd. Although one of the interesting responses I had from people was that they were in suspense about whether that would actually happen. I found that fascinating, because historically we know what happens. But I took that to mean that in the historical present of the book, there was this uncertainty, because it's never clear until the very end whether this is actually going to happen.
All right, we've got a comment here from Leslie Eckert. I read everything you write, but being a fan of all things Lincoln, this was my absolute favorite. Your take on Lincoln, Mary Todd, Joshua, and the nature of love rings very true. So that's just a little compliment there for you.
That was very nice. Thank you, Leslie.
We have a question here from Jean. Lou, what is the topic of your next work of historical fiction? What do you got on the?
We got JFK and Jackie and Lem Billings. So it'll be the three of them and some other folks kind of peeping. Joe Kennedy, the whole Kennedy menage. Yeah, it'll be there. So look for that. I don't know when.
Oh, okay. How far along are you on that?
That's a very good question. Why do you ask me that?
I'm just curious. I'm reading your face now, and I'm wondering.
Actually, one of the nice things about the pandemic is some extra time to work on books, right, Jenny? You're just
absolutely.
You're plowing ahead. I know you are. You're writing King Lear. Has there been a worse meme, by the way? Shakespeare wrote King Lear while the plague was happening. It's like, don't tell. No, that's not helpful. That's not helpful. No.
Yeah. All right, we've got a question from Judd. Did the process of researching and writing this book enhance or detract from your perception of Abraham Lincoln?
I would say neither. I think it just deepened it. I just realized more than anything else what a complex character he was and how finely unknowable he was. And I think even when you get to the end of this book, you might feel charmed by him. I hope you will, because I think he was a charming figure. He was funny, among other things. He was very funny. But I don't think you'll feel like you've completely figured him out. At least I hope you won't. And that's one of the wonderful things about fiction, by the way, is you can leave that sense of mystery. You can leave things in, what was that Keats phrase? The basically being able to hold two contradictory things together in suspension against each other. And so you get to the end of the book and think, okay, Lincoln loved both of these people, maybe. He loved them both. And,
yes.
and yeah. You felt that way?
Absolutely.
Oh, good.
No question.
That was my feeling. That was my feeling going in.
Magnificent. Well, it looks like we got a shot question here. It says, can you tell me how your historical research methods have evolved over the course of time between Mr. Timothy, the Pale Blue Eye, and up to courting Mr. Lincoln? Where do you start your research, and is there a Lewis formula?
Oh, I wish that.
We're writing it down.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I wish I could tell myself that formula. The formula, it's not a formula. I would say I spend 3 months just up front doing just basic research about the period, just so I have just the most rudimentary sense of what it looks like, what people are wearing, just so I can walk around in this world. And then, as I've said, I'm doing research along the way. I should say that usually what I say is I'm very fortunate to live 6 blocks from the Library of Congress, where I have a study shelf, full of books. And I can just stroll on down on a given morning and sit in the magnificent reading room of the Jefferson Building. If you haven't been there, whoever's listening, if you haven't been to the reading room, please, when the library reopens, open it up. So I feel really fortunate to be in DC for that reason, to have access to these extraordinary things, when I want them to. But inevitably, what I will find myself making stuff up, because there's only history can tell you so much, but only so much. And then you kind of have to, that's when the novelist goes in and says, okay, let's make the rest of this up. And I do that with no apology. I just this is what I do, right?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. That was great. Those were our questions there.
That's it?
That was it. Lou, Jenny, it was so informative. It was funny. It was just a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is
sorry about being the one technical glitch here.
What glitch? Who remembers?
I don't even remember what you're talking about.
Exactly, we've forgotten about it already.
It's so
presentation.
It's historical. No.
It was great. Thank you. What a great way to kick off the Memorial Day weekend. And I'd like to thank all of you for being with us for this spectacular presentation. I'm certain you'd love picking up your very own copy of Courting Mr. Lincoln, which you can do now by visiting our partner, independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. You can find the link in the description box below to order your copy. It's right below us here. Please plan to join us tomorrow night at 7 as ABC White House news correspondent Jonathan Karl talks about his hit book, Front Row at the Trump Show. Then on Sunday morning at 11 a.m., get the kids and tune in to see what best-selling author Adam Gidwitz, the creator of the Unicorn Rescue Society series and the Grimm trilogy, has planned for us. In the meantime, feel free to take a look around the GBF YouTube channel as well as the festival website at Gaithersburgbookfestival.org. That's Gaithersburgbookfestival.org to discover all the other amazing programs coming your way. All right, my friends, that wraps it up for tonight. I've been, and most likely will still be, Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host. Have a great evening, and as always, keep reading.